But it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Allison Rifai. And Allison has, she leads and implements the Queensland Disaster Management Research Framework within the Department of Emergency Services. No? Yeah. Yeah. You know, builds a lot of collaborations in her work between disaster management, tertiary institutions, and research sectors. Allison has more than 20 years operational disaster management experiences in roles across planning, preparedness, response and recovery in Queensland. And she's worked in, you know, some that you may remember, the 2011 floods, Brisbane floods, Cyclone Yasi, as well as deployments to support local governments in recovery plans and so on. Not the least important point to note, Allison has a PhD in geography from QUT and has worked with UQ geographers, and also with, she is an industry adjunct with the Cities Institute at Griffith. So will you join me, please, in welcoming Allison to the podium? Thanks, Allison.
Thank you very much. So hopefully I'll on. Everyone going to hear me? Great. Yep, so I'm a geographer and a disaster management geographer. It's something I hadn't thought of when I first started my career. I really enjoyed geography at school and loved storms and sitting outside. We grew up on the Gold Coast watching the storms come over, loved natural disasters, all that sort of stuff, but never ever thought of putting the two together into a career. But here I am, and always learning and lots more to learn and do, and interesting stuff that we're doing sort of moving forward over the next 12 and 18 months in this space. But I'll talk to you a little bit about where I got to now, the kind of things I do in my role at the Office of the Inspector General of Emergency Management, and just how useful the degree and the role of a geographer has been in the disaster management space. And when you talk to people, there are quite a few geographers in this space. It is really, really a great degree and a great area and a great base to use as you get into the disaster management area. All right. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander peoples as traditional owners and custodians on the land in which we meet today. I recognise their connection to land, sea and community, and pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. Now you may recognise somebody in this photo at least. I didn't have a digital copy, so I had to go back and scan it. So yeah, Irafni was of course one of my PhD supervisors along with Peter Hastings when I did my PhD looking at urban floodplain land use on the Gold Coast nearly 20 years ago, I think this year, which is quite scary to think about. And that was a really great experience and made me realise how much I love doing research in the disaster management space and how much I really wanted to work in this space and see what the possibilities are. It's, as I said, geography has been a fantastic foundation for disaster and emergency management. The systems sort of thinking perspective and looking at how systems interact with each other has really been invaluable, and I'm really using that now even in the sort of that research management role that I have in IGEM. So when I finished my PhD, I joined Emergency Management Queensland. It was at the time in 2006. So there were a lot of new positions created after Cyclone Larry and after the Indian Ocean tsunami, looking at how Queensland prepares and what local governments need to do in that space. And so I stepped into the disaster mitigation and planning team. So I didn't, on the day that that photo was taken, intend to wear corporate colours. So the EMQ colours are red, blue and white. That was at an expo we had where the helicopters that used to be under the EMQ banner were present at the time. So my first job was looking at how local governments plan for disasters and developing guidelines for disasters. And it grew from there into the operational space. So I've done lots of different sort of jobs in my time at EMQ and then into the Office of the Inspector General of Emergency Management. So Queensland's system is locally led, so local governments are the key sort of foundation in what we have. It's regionally coordinated, state facilitated, and then Commonwealth supported as well. So I've worked in State Disaster Coordination Centre, so that's that picture there, I think on the bottom left of your screen if you're looking at it. So that's the newer Disaster Coordination Centre. It used to be a much smaller version out at Kedron, where it's still based. And that's a hive of activity when disasters are actually happening across the state, coordinating resources and deployments and the operations, reporting up to the Commonwealth level, seeking support through the system, and then sort of managing the day-to-day things that happen on the ground. So I used to run the intelligence cell, which is part of the system, and through major events, severe storms, cyclones, we had marine oil spills, equine influenza at one stage, citrus canker. So all these sorts of events that the Queensland disaster management arrangements can activate to support operations for. So the intelligence cell was about collecting, coordinating information on the event. We used to produce reps throughout the day, so bring all the information together and turn it into intelligence that could help inform operations moving forward. So it was a really fantastic experience, very long shifts, lots of different events, different agencies, and it's fantastic to see it all coming together and the way that the agencies work together to support the community before, during and after a disaster. I was lucky enough to be deployed out to areas impacted by disasters to help with recovery planning. The most significant event I was probably involved with was the 2009 floods in Ingham. So we went out there after the floods that were really, really significant in the community and put the recovery structure together for them. So worked with the community and with the local government to put the governance in place to help the community recover. And then was there long enough to see the impacts of that and to see things like the childcare centre come back online. So to really see the impact that you had on the community, helping them recover. And that sort of, the planning went into the start of the recovery planning guidelines that we sort of see today. The 2011 floods was a huge part of my career, operationally, and also afterwards. We had the Commission of Inquiry, and I played a key role in that in terms of building the event chronology around what actually happened and when decisions were made, and that went into the evidence that E&Q provided to that inquiry, and that had big change on the system. And it's had a massive impact on people that work behind the scenes. Colleagues and friends today that have even left the sector, it still talk about the impact that it had and what they feel like when it starts to rain and we get flood warnings and that sort of stuff again. So it really had a significant impact on the community and the people that worked behind the scenes. I've done things like we've helped write national flood manuals. So Emergency Management Australia at the time produced manuals helping communities and local governments and agencies plan for flooding and engage with communities on flooding. So we did some work on those sorts of things. And been all over Queensland working in different disaster management related projects. We did tsunami planning with the Torres Strait Council, so that was great to go up to Thursday Island and deliver workshops up there. Been all across the state, seeing communities when they've been impacted by disasters, but also out of disaster events, seeing what they're doing to prepare for and work with their communities. So from the Gulf right out to the far west. So it's really been a career so far I've been lucky enough to see all over Queensland in good times and bad, and see what the communities do and the fantastic work that's done out there on the ground during disasters. So it's been a busy few years. So this shows you some of the natural disaster events right back to 2010. It has been busy. We used to have sort of 6 months of the year where it was pretty quiet and we could do things like guidelines and prepare. Now it's basically, I think the arrangements have been and systems been activated almost continuously for the last couple of years between fires and severe storms, floods, cyclones. And then you have things like COVID and other things that happen around the natural disasters that also impact how the system works and how the community responds and recovers at the time. It's also things like animal, agricultural diseases, those sort of things, and major events. So if you think back to the G20 summit, we've got the Olympic Games coming up. All those things have an impact on the community, and then when you put the disasters over the top, it's a very busy environment. So there's always something happening. So following a review into the police and community safety functions back in 2013, E&Q was broken up and our team was brought across to form the Office of the Inspector General of Emergency Management that we've got today. So that's Mr. Alistair Dawson, who's the current Inspector General. So the office was established back in 2014 and we're established under the Disaster Management Act, so we're established in legislation. Our role is to look at the effectiveness of the Queensland disaster management arrangements, and we do that through collaboration. So we work with the partners, we work with all the agencies and the entities that are part of the arrangements to look at how the system's working during events and after events, and what can we do to make sure that it's continuously improving. And my role in this space is looking after the research side of things, so bringing the researchers into the disaster management space to look at how we use research for that continuous improvement in practice. So we do different assurance activities. So the big thing that we do is reviews. So we can be tasked by the Minister to conduct reviews following events. So just last week, the office completed a review into the severe weather season that happened 2023-24, and we delivered that review to the Minister. We've done reviews of a lot of the more significant disasters in Queensland. We've also done some reviews that have looked at communications around dams and warnings and things that are more preemptive, so looking at what the system is like now. So again, we're mainly tasked by the government to do reviews. We do capability reviews, so we look at what kind of planning is done out in the districts at local government level and how the plans are shaping up. We've looked at things like recovery elements, warnings, shelters and evacuation, all those sorts of things. And then the capability reviews that look more at how the things are actually functioning on the ground and plans at the district and local level. So it's a big part of what we do. And take a lot of time. We have agencies come and work with us. We have the teams that go out on the road and interview people. We do community forums usually for our reviews. I think the last review had 90 submissions from the public come in, and we get submissions from agencies and entities involved. We've got the standard for disaster management. So that was something that the office is responsible for. It was the first standard of its type in Queensland, and it's outcome based. So it looks at what are the sort of things we want to see in place for disaster management. It's outcome focused, so it's not prescriptive. It allows the agencies and local governments involved to map their own way to get to that particular outcome for their community. So it's not prescriptive. It looks at their capability and capacity and needs, and allows the entities and the agencies to work towards a particular outcome based on their circumstances. And that's across things like how they manage risk, their planning and their plans, how they engage with the community, disaster operations, collaboration and coordination, so how agencies work together, and things like even the language that they use, making sure there's a common language and lexicon across the disaster management space. And then with each of those, there's indicators that we use during reviews and plan assessments just to make sure that they're on track towards achieving those outcomes. So this is my particular piece of work that I lead, which is the Queensland Disaster Management Research Framework. So when IDEM was first formed, one of the key pieces of work that we looked at was how research was used by the sector to inform what we do as a key piece of evidence in what we do. And we found that a lot of the research was sort of southern-centric, it was fire-based, it wasn't necessarily addressing the conditions that we have in Queensland and the unique environment. And also the locally led system that we've got in Queensland is different to all the other states. So we put together the Queensland Disaster Management Research Framework, which is about building those partnerships between the researchers and the disaster managers. So looking at what the disaster management research needs are. So we've just done a big environmental scan where we spoke to agencies and local government and looked at what research questions they'd like to see in the disaster management, how they use research, what they do with it, and what they'd like to do. And we're working through a list of priorities and strategic projects around that. And then it's also looking at how we bring the researchers more into that space. So how do we make sure that the researchers can link into the agencies and are actually doing work on the ground that relates to the projects that are needed by the sector. So we have a research advisory panel that we run that builds those collaborations. We have a researcher register. So we did a lot of mapping. So I'm using my mapping skills in a different way, mapping systems and processes and looking at exactly who's out there in that research ecosystem and how we can link them into the Queensland disaster management arrangements. We look at how research can be used in our reviews. So we often include a research component in our reviews, whether that's getting researchers to look at particular elements for us, or it might be community surveys, that sort of thing. We host intern students. So we've had some fantastic intern students work with us on different projects. And there's a lot happening in this research space moving forward. We have an annual research forum that I'll give you the details of at the end of the year, at the end of the presentation. But anything we can do to make research more prominent in that disaster management space. So it's great to be able to use my love of research from when I was doing my PhD early on now and really build those collaborations between the research and the uni sector. And it helps having a an understanding of how the research world works and how the universities work and how we can translate that into the disaster management sector on the ground, and then vice versa. So we're kind of got that role of a knowledge broker in the arrangement, so trying to sort of translate research into practice and make those linkages. So some of the things we do with the mapping is looking at how we implement everything from the international doctrine. So, for example, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, how is that actually delivered on the ground in Queensland, and how does our standards for disaster management help operationalise these things? So we went through and mapped all the key pieces of doctrine and legislation and frameworks that exist in that disaster management space internationally, right down to the local disaster management plans and where things are implemented on the ground, and trying to show where they all fit together and how they operationalise each other. So it's really complicated, and it's not till you map it out that you can actually see all the bits and pieces and look at what actually has to be delivered on the ground, and how do we actually make that happen. So one of the big pieces of work we did last year was looking at the actual Queensland disaster management arrangements. So in 2022, our office was tasked by the Minister to actually conduct a review into the Queensland disaster management arrangements to make sure it was fit for what we're facing into the future. So there'd been reviews around the time into fire and emergency services, the SES, marine rescue services, looking at what's needed in the space into the future. And then IGEM was tasked with doing that bigger review over the Queensland disaster management arrangements to make sure that the changes that were coming out of the other reviews could actually be implemented into the system. So the team travelled nearly 50,000 kilometres doing the review into the arrangements. I think we had over 200 practitioner meetings across Queensland. We spoke to agencies in interstate, so New South Wales and ACT and the Northern Territory. We had over 116 written submissions, and we did about 69 interviews and discussions with stakeholders to look at how the arrangements were functioning as they were and what needed to change into the future. And we presented that report to the Minister in April of 2023. And there's been a significant amount of reform in the DM space over the last few months. It's just come into effect with the 1st of July that Queensland's been working through. So my main role in that review, and what I'll walk through now, is we wanted to look back at how the Queensland arrangements actually evolved. So where did they come from? Where did they start? And what have been the significant changes as we went through? So we looked at that from not only Queensland's perspective, but also what was happening internationally at the time that shaped disaster management. And that went right back to when we sort of saw the first research in that disaster management space. So it was a really interesting bit of work that we're still using today to inform some of our practice and what we do. So going right back, we found that research into how disasters impact people and communities started in the early 1900s. The first study we've come across that sort of really fitted what we were looking at was on a community in 1920 in Canada. There was a big ship explosion in Halifax in 1917, and it killed nearly 2,000 people. And that was one of the first studies that started to look at, well, what kind of impact did that event happen on the community around? And then there were some big disasters in the United States during the 1930s and 50s and 60s. And the researchers started looking at, well, there are different phases to how we prepare for disasters and how we respond to disasters. And that's what we started to see things like emergency relief and a recovery phase and a rehabilitation phase sort of come into play. And they turned into what we have now, which is what you might see as PPRR, which is prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. So they're the disaster phases that we work with today. So you could see really early on researchers putting those pieces of the puzzle together to look at how these events impacted communities and what it actually meant in terms of planning and response and what we could do better. So looking at Australia, it was really interesting because we were doing this work just post-COVID, and you could see in the early 1900s there were some conflicts between the governments of the Commonwealth at the time and the state borders around things like closing down borders for pandemics at the time. So similar sort of issues that we were seeing during COVID, they were having arguments about right back then. So it was quite interesting and quite humorous to read through some of the early accounts of those and see, well, wow, they were having the same sort of conversations with the federal government back then around borders and access and all those sorts of things during pandemics. So in Queensland, we had civil defence acts for war periods that looked at what things would happen during airstrikes and air raids, and they sort of formed the first civil defence space that we saw turn into the disaster emergency management sector that we've got today. So in about, I think it was 1967, we had a civil defence organisation was established in Queensland, but there wasn't anything like legislation that brought it together. There were lots of separate pieces of legislation that were war-based that looked at civil defence, so signals and wardens and things like the role of air wardens, all that kind of stuff, and the role of police and rescue, first aid, welfare and transport. The skeleton of what we have today was there, but it was sort of all over the place, little bits and pieces, and very much war-based legislation. So the 70s was really, really busy in terms of disasters, impacts in Australia, and particularly Queensland. We had, in Australia, had Tropical Cyclone Tracy in Darwin. Western Australia had a big one called Cyclone Trixie. And we had Ada and Wanda, of course, in Queensland, which caused flooding in Queensland and New South Wales. So the federal government established a natural disaster organisation in the Department of Defence in 1974, which is the first of its kind, and also established a National Operations Centre in Canberra. So that was trying to provide some centralised support for the states. We had Tropical Cyclone Ada and major creek flooding in Brisbane and the 74 floods, of course, and they were key elements of sort of shaping the disaster management arrangements and systems. So in 1970, you had a state disaster relief organisation that was led by the Queensland Police, which was part of that civil defence organisation. When that then turned into the start of the emergency service in the mid-1970s. We also saw different phases of disaster management being recognised in Queensland as well at the time. So we had sort of a warning phase, an impact phase and a recovery phase, and all the bits and pieces that went across with those. We had a state counter disaster act that came into place in 1975, which was the first whole of government approach that tried to coordinate different activities under these elements for Queensland. And it gave the first legal powers to preserve human life, and also started to define what a disaster actually is. So in those terms, it was a flood, it was an earthquake, cyclone, a storm, an eruption, a seismic sea wave, plague or epidemic as well. So the 70s was a big period of change for the disaster management arrangements in Queensland. Again, the 80s, we saw a lot happening internationally. So you had the World Meteorological Organization that set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that's still in place today and very, very influential. We had the Ash Wednesday bushfire in Australia, so that had significant change at a national level. And then you saw lots more interaction between the Commonwealth and the states about how they could support each other. What kind of support could the Commonwealth provide to states during and after disasters? We also had the Newcastle earthquake in 1989, and that had huge ramifications for building codes in Australia, for example. In Queensland, you had the Bureau of Emergency Services came into being, and that started to bring the police and the emergency services together with ambulance under one agency. So you started to see the agencies coming together in that one space. And that continued to occur even today. So the 90s was another really interesting decade internationally as well. So it was actually coined the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction by the United Nations, quite the mouthful. And they had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So a lot happening internationally in terms of frameworks and recognising the impact of climate and the need to reduce disaster risk. In Australia, Emergency Management Australia was launched with the Australian Institute of Emergency Management, which was a centralised training facility based at Mount Macedon in Victoria, and which was a fantastic facility that brought different agencies together from across Australia to train in different aspects of disaster and emergency management. In Queensland, you had more changes. The Department of Emergency Services was established, and the first state disaster management plan came into being, which was quite significant. And that had things like functional and threat-specific plans and lead agencies. And it also established some state-level committees to look at particular elements. So there was Queensland Tropical Cyclone Committee, there was an Earthquake Coordination Committee established, and a Flood Warning Consultative Committee. And overall, the 90s was sort of this decade from response focus moving towards mitigation. So how do we start to prepare for and prevent disasters, not just respond to them? For the 2000s, again, there was a lot of work happening internationally. We had the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. So that started to bring the disaster space and the sustainable development climate space together and look at what were the implications of those were. COAG, so the Council of Australian Governments, did a very big review into the disaster management arrangements. And we also had the 2009 Black Saturday fires in Victoria that had huge implications on the sector. So the move nationally was towards, again, from response and operations towards how do we build community resilience to disasters. And that was very much what was happening internationally as well. In Queensland, there was a review done of the State Disaster Coordination, the State Counter Disaster Act. And that then changed into the Disaster Management Act that we have in place today. And you saw lots more different elements coming into the disaster management space, like land use planning. So there was a planning policy for floods, state planning policy that started to look at, well, what are the land use decisions and what do they mean in terms of disaster, and how do we look at risk and the land use planning decisions, and what do we need to put in place to make sure that we're minimising the risk to the community with the planning decisions that we're making. So there were also a lot of state government guidelines developed to help local governments and disaster districts plan for disasters. Lots of guidelines for particular hazards, guidelines to help up shelters and evacuation centres, all those sorts of things. So it was a very sort of guideline intensive period. And then, of course, in March 2006, we had Tropical Cyclone Yasi that crossed the coast in far north Queensland. And following that, there were lots of recommendations about how do we engage the non-government sector into that space, so the likes of the Red Cross and the volunteer organisations, into the planning and preparing for disasters, not just during response and recovery. So some fundamental shifts happened in that space. And I know some of you have been involved in Red Cross and the volunteer side of things, and that certainly grew during the decade since. So 2010, again, was a big year, particularly for Southeast Queensland. You, of course, had the World Trade Center attacks in the States, so that had implications internationally for disaster and emergency management. You had the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai framework, excuse me, that we're halfway through the implementation of, and that looks at disaster risk reduction, and it's been a foundation piece in disaster and emergency management internationally. Australia is a signatory to that, and we look at how that's implemented, excuse me, into the disaster management system, right down to that mapping that I showed you before. It's how the elements of that, how are they reflected and operationalised on the ground and what we do on a day-to-day basis. We had the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience. So resilience was very much the focus of Australia as well. And then, of course, we had the Brisbane floods during November 2010 and February 2011. We had North Queensland impacted by Yasi, which was a Category 5, a significant event, and major flooding that occurred through central and southern areas of the state. And at the time, about 99% of the state was actually disaster declared, which is quite significant. The Queensland Reconstruction Authority, which is still in place today, were established following the 2011 floods. So Operation Queenslander was a big campaign launched to help Queensland recover from the flooding at the time. It really changed the way recovery was approached in Queensland, the governance arrangements, the different groups and functions, and how recovery happens from the state right down to the local level, and those arrangements are still in place today. You had the Flood Commission of Inquiry, which was a significant piece of work following the 2011 floods, and as I said, MQ was involved and provided a submission. And that changed a lot of what we did and how we do things moving forward. And there's still recommendations being worked on from the Commission of Inquiry today, and different projects and things that are in place. There was another big review of the Queensland disaster management arrangements that tend to happen after big events. And as we saw during the history of these sorts of things, that's when you have big change, a large event signals big change and reviews and changes in the way we do things and learnings. And that was the Police and Community Safety Review. So following that, that's where EMQ was disbanded. The Office of the Inspector General of Emergency Management was formed out of recommendations from that review, and different elements of response and recovery changed and grew as well. And later in the decade, we started to see climate change adaptation coming into the mix, and how we actually look at that in the disaster management space. And there's been work done to look at how the disaster management arrangements integrate climate and the arrangements sort of climate ready, is a sector climate ready, and what does that mean? And there was actually a climate adaptation plan for the emergency services space as well. So it was, again, a very, very big decade. But it gets more complex. 2020, we had the Black Summer bushfires in 2019 and 2020. And again, that had a big change in terms of disaster management, resilience and climate change. So really starting to look at, well, what's the environment moving forward? What do we need to be considering when we're looking at managing disasters? So there was a Royal Commission, of course, and that made recommendations about coordination arrangements. How do the agencies work together? How do we share information to support decision making? What was the role of the Defence Force in disasters? And again, there's been some recent reviews into that as well. It looked at the role of Indigenous land and fire management and the prominence of that that's in place now. And then what sort of land use planning and building regulations do we need into the future to make sure that we're adapting to the climate and not just being able to respond to disasters as they happen. Australia did a submission for the midterm review of the Sendo framework. And that's really looking at how complex the environment has become. Disaster management now occurs in a really complicated space when you consider we had COVID. Communities have a lot of challenges around today living versus how do they actually respond during a disaster. So all those elements make community resilience slightly different for each event. It also makes how communities respond and recover to events change. So it's a really complicated space that we have to actually manage disasters in. So we need to make sure we're looking forward at what is coming in terms of the future and making sure that the arrangements are best placed to be able to handle what's on the horizon. So things like shared responsibility, looking at the role of governance and networks, how we work together, how we share information, how we communicate across different systems and boundaries, the investment, innovation. This is where research plays such a big role, looking, well, what are the issues moving forwards? How do we look at things from a different perspective? How do we bring in elements of AI and different learnings and different technologies to make sure that the system's as robust as it can be moving forward? This is when the Queensland Government requested that IDEM do the review into the Queensland disaster management arrangements, and that sort of was part of the significant changes we've seen in the system that's occurred over the last 6 to 12 months. So we were asked to look at the role of the agencies in the Queensland disaster management arrangements, the effectiveness of the different committees that support the governance of the arrangements, the different state level disaster management functions, and anything that sort of would look at that transition of the state emergency service, Queensland, and different elements from fire across to the police environment that we see today. So we made 10 recommendations that looked at prevention, preparedness, response and recovery, as well as resilience. So resilience had been separate to disaster management. There are elements of it. It's all about risk. The review and the arrangements that have come into being have brought resilience into the disaster management space. So we're seeing resilience reflected in the Disaster Management Act and disaster management reflected in the Queensland Reconstruction Authority work as well. So we're starting to see the better linkage of disaster management and resilience and climate adaptation and all those sorts of things that used to be very, very separate, but really it's all based on risk and how we respond to risk. It's just a different time period. So it's been great to see some of those changes in the system. So this is what's been happening over the last 12 months. So back in October, the transition of the disaster management function moved from what used to be the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services across to Queensland Police Service, and then elements of recovery and resilience moved across to the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. So it's a different system now, and what used to be the Queensland Fire and Emergency Service has now become the Queensland Fire Department, and they're a lead agency for fire. So we've seen lots of change that came into being in legislation that had everything in place and established on the 1st of July this year. So there were several new pieces of legislation introduced around Queensland Emergency Services and Marine Rescue and SES. Emergency Service has moved to the Queensland Police Service as an independent entity there. Marine Rescue Queensland was established again by the Queensland Police Service, and then that brought into the space the Volunteer Coast Guard, Volunteer Marine Rescue into a joint organisation. And then the legislation that came into being on the 1st of July introduced the changes by the Disaster Management and Other Legislation Amendments Act in 2024. So I like this diagram. One of the things that we often have to do is prepare speaking notes for the Inspector General to go and deliver presentations at conferences. And this one that sort of looks at, when you think about the systems approach, the systems that we're working with today are the result of decisions that we've made in the past and also decisions that we're making into the future. So it's like that continuous learning and change and feeding off each other into what we will have into the future. So I think COVID really taught us how vulnerable communities are and brought in lots of complexities to how we live and what we do and things that we hadn't considered previously, and just how interconnected we all are. And we had a lot of learnings from that in the disaster management space. You've got things like biohazards and climate change, cybersecurity, things like polycrisis, all these sort of things that are happening that make it a really, really complex environment just to do disaster management in. So lots of new challenges that the system needs to be looking forward to and trying to bring into that space. And also the speed at which we've got to make decisions is rapidly increasing. So that's a continual drive for information, the information that's in the social media space. How do we bring that into what we're doing, and how do we look at what the community is telling us and reflecting in that kind of environment? Misinformation, so making sure it's the right information that's out there. All those sorts of things that we've got to work into decision making and how we manage different disasters. And then how we gather information and interpret it, that's all changing in terms of how we act and respond to the world around us. So a lot of the traditional ways that we used to look at things and the touch points and the information sources aren't as reliable as they used to be. So we've got to look at new ways and new ways of looking at information and how we turn that into intelligence and how we help make decisions for the community. So we've got to better understand things like cascading impacts, systemic risk, societal responses. One thing that COVID taught us was that compounding risk and compounding events. So when you have different events layered on top of each other, that has a big impact on how the community can respond to and recover from something. So what would have happened if we had to put people into a cyclone shelter when we had the COVID restrictions, all those sorts of things? They're the kind of things that decision makers had to look at the time and think, well, how would we manage and how would we logistically do that? So lots of new challenges and learnings, and the system is constantly changing and learning and trying to look forward now to make sure it's best positioned to deal with the ever increasingly complex world in which we live in. So it's really about being able to absorb the new and the unfamiliar things into the system that we haven't, which is where research plays such a big role in what we do in terms of being able to help us sort of challenge how we do things and challenge the norm and bring in different perspectives and ways of thinking. The researchers that we work with cover every discipline you can imagine, from looking at how animals and vets operate in emergencies, right through to having models of the system that we can play with and interact with and sort of test things and put in decisions and see what actual impact that has on the ground. What's happening in the AI space, the artificial intelligence space, lots of different ways that we can gather information from the community. And then, well, how do we then use these different technologies to better engage with the community and communicate about risk and get warnings out, etc. So much happening, and so many exciting bits of research that we're trying to bring into that space as well. So one of the things that we've got coming up in November is our annual Queensland Disaster Management Research Forum. The focus this year on the forum is looking at how we embed research into practice. So we've got presentations from agencies and researchers looking at how they've come up with a particular research problem, what research have they been doing, and how has that actually changed practice on the ground. One of the other things we also like to do with the research forum is showcase what the early career researchers are doing in this space. So that's people that are within that sort of 5 to 7 year period of finishing their degree, or they're currently doing a postgraduate degree or studying in the disaster management space. And that's where we're really seeing some innovative new approaches to disaster and emergency management. So it's great to be able to showcase what they're doing through presentations and posters, and just helping them link into the disaster management sector as much as they can. So part of my role is helping early career researcher students to try and link into the agencies when they're wanting to do bits and pieces of research. Whoops, I'll go back on. And one thing that if there's any early and mid-career researchers online that might be interested, Natural Hazards Research Australia, which is the national research organisation, has early and mid-career researcher and academic practitioner network, which is a mouthful. And we've also got a Queensland node manager for NHRA based here in Brisbane, and that's Nicola Moore, who will be more than happy to talk to any of the early career researchers or mid-career researchers that might be here or online about linking into their network. And again, I'm more than happy to put you in contact with Nicola to talk about what they're doing and how you can be involved. And then I'm here as well to help anybody that wants to link into the disaster management research space or has any particular questions. We're always happy to answer questions and see where we can help and help students and researchers and things. I am a sci-fi geek, so I try and get a sci-fi reference into all of my presentations where I can. This was very apt when we were starting off doing the evolution in terms of going back and looking at where things were happening in the disaster management space and the evolution of that. And one of the research forums we did a couple of years ago was that, looking back, being present and looking forward. And we brought historians, historian researchers in to look at where research had come from in the DM space and the different sort of perspectives they put on it. So it's a very exciting space to be working in. And as I said, geography is a really fantastic base, I guess, degree and foundation to get into that disaster management space. So I encourage any sort of early career geographers out there who are interested in working in that space, please look at it, and please reach out if you'd like to have a conversation about what the options might be and where we can maybe link you in. That's pretty much me.
Thanks very much, Alison. So I think as citizens, we often don't realise what's going on in the background, you know, when you hear about a flood or cyclone, fire. And Alison has shown us this evening the very long history, really, of the evolution of disaster management, particularly in Queensland and further afield. So it's been, you know, really great to hear that evolution side of things in the disaster management space, but also now to hear what's important work and complicated systems are in place now for this work. So thank you again, Alison. Now, if there are any questions, either from the audience here or Lilia's just looking at the Zoomers, if they've got questions, we'll have them now. Okay, one over there, Chris.
Yeah, Christopher Zinn, you do lots of reviews, and I'm sure you make lots of recommendations. How many of them are actually implemented? And what are the real barriers? Give us a taste of what you're asking for, and what are the problems, you know, what are the #1 areas that you'd like to see go through?
I would have to look at the figures in terms of proportion of recs implemented. We report to Cabinet on that. There are certain things that come up in most reviews, so things like communications and warnings and that kind of stuff that I think we're always working on. But there's also been, I think, a lot of change in the sector. We've seen with subsequent reviews that there's been improvements and things change based on previous reviews and recommendations. So I think there's always work to be done. I think there's certain things that come up each time, and we're seeing that with the research side of things as well, that there's always learnings and different ways of doing things and different experiences in each. So yeah, I don't know, I guess it's the world in which all these things happen that we're constantly looking at, well, how do we do things better, and what was the situation at the time and what was different about that particular event and that particular community situation, and how can we listen and work that into the system to make it improve. So I'd have to look back. There's a big sheet of recommendations that we put in since the start of IGEM. So yeah.
I mean, do you get the emergency services to work together any better, or are they working together well?
I think they are. I think, and again, things have changed over the years, improved. The governance has changed, the arrangements have changed and grown and developed. There's always things that can work better, depending on what the particular events were, and again the context at the time. But I think things are always improving. Yeah, I think the locally led nature of the system is a strength in Queensland. If we let the arrangements work to that, that's when they work really well.
That's the only one at the moment. Questions here?
I guess it follows on from what Christopher was saying, that it strikes me in this sort of area, you need to be fairly visionary in your development. So has there been any particular pieces of technology, systems, things or stuff in the past? And if you had a magic wand of $1 trillion, as a visionary, where would you direct that effort to make really significant exemplar advances in this area? There are things to me as a technologist like the internet, radar mapping that's being done these days. So is there anything that pops into your mind and says, wow, that really made a difference to the way we do things because we had that GPS, whatever it happens to be? And where would you put that in the future?
At a recent conference, some of the work that they're doing with sort of biosensors and robotics and being able to go in and really assess the damage after an event where you might not be able to put people in yet, but also putting those things in the environment before something happens so you get a picture of what it was like before and then can actually compare it to after. So I think there's lots of stuff happening in that space and in the artificial intelligence space. I think we need to make better use of social media and how we take that constant pulse of what the community is telling us. That's something I'd like to see more work done into the future. How do we actually get that constant read of what's happening in the community? So if something were to happen, we know where they're at, and then what can they tell us about what the community is experiencing and feeling and how they're reacting, and how can we use that to better inform decision making, that sort of stuff. So that real-time information, I think, is something that we still need to do work on. But what's happening with the sensing and the biomimicry and the robotic space is way beyond my ability to understand, but it's very cool, and I think that's where we have the researchers looking into that sort of stuff and how we can actually use it, and bringing in that technology that you wouldn't normally work with in the DM space, and how can that help what we do, and not just during the response, but also again, how do we just engage with the community on a day-to-day basis to look at what they're doing and needing and that sort of stuff. So I think the AI space is a huge one, and looking at how we can use it to model the system and test decisions and test different things next to the system when it's happening, so we can see how it's actually working and what we do. Yeah.
In those new arrangements, the police seem to have a lot more responsibility, or let's say, control over things than they used to. That's moved along, hasn't it?
It's moved about a bit. So when you look back at previous reviews, it's moved from fire to some emergency services and back to police. It's moved around a lot. At the moment, and for the future, it's back with the police, and that's where we've got the Queensland Reconstruction Authority looking at that risk and resilience side of things and recovery, and Queensland Police looking at the disaster management, the operational side of things. So that's where it is. But it's been interesting during the evolution to see how it's moved across the different agencies at different times and changed, and the different reasons for that. So yeah, it's interesting.
I see one of the earlier websites that you put up, it was I don't know whether it's www, but the thing was Harden Up. So
yes,
I sort of thought
that was an early
message, wasn't it?
It was an early message. I don't know whether it was the right one at the time, but I think it's more a message now around shared responsibility. So everybody's got a role to play in preparing for and responding to and recovering from disasters, whether it's someone at home and what they can do versus an agency or a non-government organisation. So very much that shared responsibility approach to how we prepare for and respond to and recover from disasters.
There's another question online here from Keegan. What would you love to see taught in geography in high school to best prepare the upcoming generation for responding to natural disasters, especially in Queensland? Keegan is a teacher. Yeah.
Okay. I think things like that shared responsibility approach, so that everybody's got a role to play in disaster and emergency management, and bringing in the climate space and the resilience space and looking at it from a risk perspective. So it's really all one big system, and it's how we change things in the system, whether that be through decisions or planning or having an event actually happen. So systems thinking and that kind of thing, I think, is really, really important for people wanting to get into that space moving forward. Yeah, I think a systems approach to disaster management, the environment, and how things are all connected together, and then how the community responds and what's happening in the community at the time as well. So that sort of thinking.
Any further questions here? Another
I'm
one.
allowed to ask just one more.
Sure.
I've already done one. You talked about the Newcastle earthquake. That put earthquakes on the
Yep.
Australian agenda. Then there was the Asian tsunami. Then, you know, BOM were warning us about one last week.
Yep.
Didn't actually happen.
Yep.
You have a list of incredibly unlikely natural disasters that haven't happened many millions of years, such as volcanoes or meteorite strikes, that perhaps keep you up at night, because you know, we could have natural disasters got nothing to do with climate change.
Yep.
That's where all the focus is.
Yeah, there's plans nationally for, you know, space debris and for solar storms and all that sort of stuff. There's you know, planning in place on how Australia can support New Zealand if there's a significant rupture to one of their fault lines. One of the things we learned when we were doing the tsunami workshops years ago was that tsunamis would be different in Queensland. You wouldn't necessarily get the cues that you see overseas where the water retreats. It's something like a nearshore landslide that is possibly the biggest tsunami risk for Queensland, and that would just bring a wave on shore. So all these things that you didn't think of or didn't know about until you started to work in this space. Things like Gladstone is the sort of the earthquake hotspot for Queensland. So I think there's I don't know, there's plans for everything. So, and there's people in the arrangements, you know, nationally and internationally, whose job it is to sort of challenge and come up with what might happen and make sure that we exercise and plan for, and the arrangements take those sorts of things into place. I think the biohazard and the pandemic space is a scary one, because as we saw through COVID, how things change so significantly, and you know, nature will always find a way to, I guess, navigate its way through and throw curveballs our way. So those sorts of things I think are tricky and will always, you know, be that unknown quantity. And then again, a conference a few weeks ago, they were talking about the risks associated with AI and what that could actually do. And you don't necessarily think of those sorts of things being a threat to humanity. So there's always new challenges, I suppose, that are coming up. And having a sci-fi interest as well, you've got that that element as well too. So, but the good thing is knowing that the systems are there and the planning and you know, the people are looking at how we can respond to and handle those situations as well in the background.
Can I ask, does that come into with the latest one from Israel, with the the claim was Israel putting the devices, the things in the devices. Is that something now that we've had to stop thinking about?
And that sort of stuff comes under that police, you know, sort of counter-terrorism space, which is slightly different to the disaster management environment. So, you know, the disaster management arrangements would support potentially a counter-disaster situation that would be led by police from a criminal point of view. So, but all those things come into it. And again, with planning for the Olympic Games coming up, they'd be looking at all those contingencies, what could happen. We saw a presentation at a conference a couple of weeks ago where emergency services in Victoria were hacked and their systems were taken down. And it was things like they had to manually open the doors at the firehouses to be able to let the engines out and turn lights on and off, and things that they hadn't put contingency plans in place for. So all those elements are part of things that they're looking at in terms of the system and what you can need to look at. So yeah.
I guess things have changed rapidly.
Yes.
It's good to hear that you know, the system is you know, coming to terms with all these new things, as well as the standard disasters that we are familiar with in our state and in the country. If there are no more further questions, either on Zoom, nothing there, or from the audience here, we might give Alison a break. But thank you very much again for coming along tonight. There were quite a few on Zoom. And please will you join me in thanking Alison for her presentation.